any difficulty understanding what I'm talking about, or wants me to talk a little bit slower, or can't understand my accent because it's maybe a little bit strange, then just shout up and I will try to speak a little bit more clearly or to speak a little bit more slowly so that you can understand what I'm talking about. The the title of this session is The Golden Days of Computer Game Music. So I thought I would maybe go right back to how things all started for me back in the days of over just about 20 years ago or something like that, and go through a little bit about how I got started and what used to happen in the early days. First of all, my background was always as a musician, and back in 1980, I had a house, and I had various keyboards and synths and drum machines and things like that. And I was working as a musician in those days, and I was also very interested in electronics as well. And I used to buy a lot of the electronics magazines and build those little kits and little projects that they had in those magazines. And round about that time, they were talking a lot about computers and programming and how that was really going to affect what was going to be happening in the music business. And they had little articles in the magazines about programming, and most of it was BASIC or Forth or something like that. And I used to read those things, and they had in BASIC they had things like let A equals A plus B, and that was something that was just completely foreign to somebody who'd been never known anything about BASIC. And so I was very interested in BASIC and computers at that time, and because I just couldn't figure out what on earth A equals A plus B meant. It was just bizarre to me. What the hell are these people talking about? So I was looking around at computers in 1982 or whatever it was, and there were various things like the Memotech, and then there was the early Sinclair kit machines, which was the touch panel type machine, which you could buy as a kit. And then the VIC-20 was out. Then there was a new machine called the C64 just came out, and that had a much better sound chip. And I was interested in music, and this thing was advertised on the TV. And the advert that they used to have at that time featured an elephant because the C64 had 64K of memory. And so, the adverts at the time used to say, this has got C64, it's got 64K of memory, it's like an elephant. Nobody will ever fill this memory because it's got so much, And so I thought, well, that's good enough for me, So I bought a C64, and then I switched it on and nothing happened. And then I typed in a program from the early book that you used to get with the C64 had so many mistakes in it. It was just, if anybody ever got one of those original books, it was just so frustrating because you would type in something from that book and nothing would ever work. But basically, it did enough to spark my interest, and I was determined that this stupid little box like this was not going to make me look like a complete idiot after I would type something in and nothing would happen. That was it was one of those challenges where, I was determined not to be beaten down by a stupid little box that couldn't do anything. So I persevered with this thing, and I eventually got, learned BASIC and learned a lot about the graphics side of what was going on with this box. And then I was reading about assembly language and how much better and how much faster that was. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to dabble with assembly language. So first thing I did in assembly language on a C64 was move a sprite across the screen like that. And if you ever did that in BASIC, you know, on the C64, it would move like that. You do it in assembly language, and you couldn't even see it move across the screen. The only problem was in that time I didn't have an assembler, so I had to basically poke the numbers in memory and then just do a sys call and see what happened. Most of the time, of course, it crashed. So, but anyway, that got my interest going, and I got heavily into learning hexadecimal 6502, and the next thing that I had to try to learn was this business of interrupts. That was just completely a weird concept. None of the books, none of the people I talked to really explained how it all worked. But like everything else, eventually, something clicks and it falls into place, and you understand what interrupts are. And then I started coding, a music player and some of the graphic type effects. I wrote graphic editors and things like that as well, because that all helped to learn assembly language. So learning hex and hexadecimal 6502 interrupts was all really the thing that kind of stimulated my imagination. And like everybody here, I was a complete and utter fanatic about this stuff. I mean, I would basically keep working until 5 o'clock in the morning, and then of course we had tape machines in those days, so I'd work till 5 o'clock in the morning and then think, oh God, I have to save this stuff. I got at least another hour and a half, because I got to do 2 saves on cassette, which would take like 45 minutes of source code. You had to do 2 saves, otherwise you just couldn't risk just saving once, And then we'd get up in the next morning, and first thing you would do before you did anything was start the load from tape, because that would take another 45 minutes to load up, assuming that there wasn't an error, So you would start the load and then have breakfast. What happened after that was I kind of dabbled doing some educational software, because I thought that was a really good idea. So I did a suite of 3 programs, and took them to the schools, and they thought they were really good, but they said that, well, we don't have enough money to spend on any of this stuff, we just have to buy books. And so I thought, well, what else am I going to do, So I started looking at the games, and the games that were around in like 1982 and 83, most of the music was done by the programmer. The programmer did everything in those days, and some of the music was just absolutely diabolical. I mean, it was embarrassing, It was like a drunken monkey, on the piano trying to play the Blue Danube or something, And I thought, there has to be, an opening for somebody who can at least get the notes right and, in the correct order, for God's sake, And what I did after that was I started working with a games company to produce a game, and the company was doing this. There's a breakfast cereal called Weetabix. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Weetabix. And so they had this little character that looked like a Weetabix cereal with legs, And so we were going to do this game, based upon this, and I wrote graphic editors, I wrote, you know, run length compression routines for graphics to do all this stuff, and of course they could never produce the game because of the fact that, you know, they hadn't been in touch with Weetabix about this, and so, you know, it's like, hello, you know, and so the company went under just as I basically had finished the game. It took me like 8 months to do this thing, and the few people who ever saw this thing thought that, you know, they thought the graphics were okay. You know, I did all the graphics myself. They thought the game really sucked, but they thought the sound was just like fantastic, you know. They thought the music was great. So I thought, okay, that kind of puts me game -5, graphics, you know, like 2, music like 8. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. So I started, you know, sending demos out, and eventually somebody, you know, give us a break, and I started doing tunes. The earliest things that I did were for Mastertronics, which was the Action Biker, and the thing on a spring for Gremlin Graphics. So I want to talk about a little bit about what happened and how that really evolved into a culture. What happened was, in the early days when you know, I started doing that stuff, it was very much kind of like, okay, you know, I'm going to do something which I think is very kind of middle of the road and very toy-like, you know. So those early games were very much very simple kind of, you know, games and very simple little tunes. And then something strange happened, you know, where after somewhere around about, what was the game called? God. It was after One Man and His Droid, which was one of the early games. There was another game after that called The Last V8, and another game called Phantoms of the Asteroid, where basically they were letting me just write anything I wanted to write, and you know, and everybody thought you know, that everything was just fantastic, you know. And at that time, it turned into just a dream of a job, because, you know, you were getting paid money for writing exactly what you wanted to write. And not only that, it got even more bizarre, because it turned into it developed into a culture, a cultural thing. And one of the things that happened was there was a demo scene started to evolve because of that. There was a huge, you know, pirate scene in Germany at that time of, you know, hackers and crackers and people like that. And you know, I was telling one of the guys yesterday about it, where, you know, they used to call me up and say, "What are you working on? What game are you working on?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm doing this thing for software projects called Dragon's Lair or something, you know." And they say, "Have you finished it?" I says, "Yeah, I've sent all my stuff off. You know, the game is supposed to be released in, you know, a couple of weeks." And they had like great pride in cracking the game, and they would send me a disc of a cracked game before it was released. And they'd put their own, you know, message on there, scrolling message and stuff. And so, you know, there was a period that I went through where, you know, every morning I would get up and the postman would come. Like in those days, the postman would come twice a day, you know. The postman would come and knock on the door, and there'd be a bloody big pile of discs, you know. And then he'd come later on in there, there'd be another bloody big pile of discs. And they were all from, you know, all these different kind of crack groups, and they had such pride in, you know, they wanted to be the first, not only to send me a copy of the game before it was released, but with their own, you know, messages on there. And one of the other things that was around, probably, I don't know, maybe 1980, 86, 87, there was a thing called CompuNet. I don't know if anybody's heard of CompuNet, but this was in the early days of the modem. You used to have this ugly-looking device which used to go onto your telephone, and there was a box used to hook up to a C64. It was used to run at 72 baud. So, you know, if anybody knows anything about modems, the modems, you know, telephone modems on a PC run at 56K baud. This used to run at 72 baud. So that's literally, you know, one character a second, 8 by 8 pixels. So anyway, a lot of people used to they subscribed to this CompuNet thing, and that also basically was a way of sending text messages. It was like a real primitive kind of a chat room thing back then. The only problem was it used to create horrendous phone bills. But that also helped develop this whole culture. And then, you know, I would say around about, you know, 1986, it was the whole kind of C64 game scene had really changed a lot and developed into a kind of this European culture where not only did the games reflect a certain culture, but the music also reflected a culture as well. The music at that time was really heavily influenced by a lot of other things that were going on in the 1980s. Like, for instance, in the 80s, there was a new romantic movement going on. A lot of synth bands were playing. A lot of the people who were involved on the, you know, the early days of the C64 were all listening to people like, you know, Jean-Michel Jarre and Kraftwerk and all these kind of bands. And so that influenced what people did. And also because of the fact that the C64, you know, you only had like the 3 voices to play with, that also limited what you could do musically. And so you tended to, you know, the limitations of the machine force you to write in a certain kind of a stylistic way, which helped to develop that culture. The other thing about being involved in the early days of what was going on was that there was a real sense of, you know, although you didn't know it at the time because you were just kind of riding this whole tide, this whole tidal wave of kind of development. But at the time, there was a lot of pioneering going on with everything to do with games and music and computers, and the sense of freedom that people had in those days was just extraordinary, because you could branch out and, you know, do pretty much whatever you wanted to do, and as long as it didn't sound like this drunken monkey trying to play the Blue Danube, you know, people would really be happy with what was going on. The sense of you know, looking back on those days, the sense of enjoyment was just unbelievable, because the you know, like I say, watching everybody here reminds me of what I used to be like in the 1980s. I had an absolute blast. I mean, I loved every minute of it. I just couldn't wait, you know, to get out of bed, you know, get up the next morning and switch on the machine, and, you know, I would dream up, you know, some crazy thing that I could add to you know, assembly language routine to do something, and I couldn't wait to code it up and see if I could get this thing to do what I wanted to do. And it was just an absolute, probably for me, you know, I would say that was, you know, probably the most fun that I ever had in the the video game business over the last, 15 to 20 years, because it was that sense of, absolute freedom, and the sense that, you could, just do whatever you want. The way that we did things in those days was purely, people often said to me, well, did you have a MIDI sequencer? Well, no, there was no MIDI sequencers. Do you have a tracker? No, there was no trackers. What did you use? So the answer to that question is that we all just used purely an assembler, and we coded everything up in an assembler. And well, how did you edit the music? Well, what I used to do was load up a machine code monitor, and I would literally, display the bytes in real time, and the music was all working on the triggered on the raster interrupt, and so I would start changing the numbers in real time to alter the synth settings, and to alter musical notes and things. And so I would tend to work on like 4-bar chunks that I would get to repeat, let these 4 bars play, and I would just sit on that hex editor, monitoring the numbers and changing things, like 3C hex would be a C, 4-8 hex would be a C, 3-0 would be a C, and I used to know these numbers backwards, and if the high bit was set, that would be an indication of like a patch change or something like that. And I would sit and tweak all those numbers until I had the 4 bars, pretty much the way that I wanted them to sound, and then that would let me then continue on, and expand for another 16 bars or something like that. The few other strange things happened in the 80s, where I can tell you a few stories that happened, the like Commando story is interesting, because a guy calls me up at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and says, the guy from Elite Systems calls me up and says, I've booked you a train ticket to come down from Newcastle to Birmingham. Can you be on the train? I says, no, I'm dead busy, He says, I'm desperate. I need like some sound for this game, and so I've booked you a ticket. Can you be on it? I says, well, how much are you going to pay us, So he quotes a figure, and I said, okay, I'll do it for that. And so I gets on a train at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I gets down in Birmingham about 5:30, and then he takes me to the pub. And then we eventually goes back to the office about 8 o'clock, and this is for the Commando game, and I starts working on the Commando thing, and then everybody goes home. I'm left in the office on my own, and I have like the game music and a high score, and then I got to look at the game and do all these, get a list of all the sound effects and do all this stuff. Anyway, I worked through the night and got all the sound effects done, and then I finished at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was like, there was these rows of these benches where the people had all these C64s, and so what I did was, before everybody came in, I loaded the music up on every one of these C64s and I turned it up as loud as I could. When everybody came in, there's just this absolute cacophony of all these machines playing the Commando music, And then I got on a train and went home and started working on something else. So that was the kind of thing that used to happen in those days. One of the other things that happened was we were always looking for ways to try to find something that the machine could do that it really wasn't designed to do. used to look in the manual on the C64, and it would say things like, you know, you look at the diagram, it say X, or you know, don't use this bit, you know, it doesn't. It's a don't care bit, and then there'd be a little note saying, you know, don't set this bit, whatever you do. Of course, we'd say, okay, I don't care. I'm going to try setting the bit and see if it does anything, you know. And we were always looking for ways to try to squeeze more out of this thing by, you know, doing things in assembler and tweaking around. And I remember I had to do this game, and I called the guy up and I said, so, you know, what kind of music do you want for this? You know, and the guy was stoned out of his brain. I could tell that he'd been, you know, smoking some stuff. And he said, oh, I just want some Hendrix, man. So I thought, okay, well, I can't really do, you know, do justice to the famous Jimi Hendrix. So, but I did this heavy rock tune with a sample guitar thing in it, you know, and that was about as close as I could get to doing Hendrix. So we did try to do things with like 4-bit sample sounds and things like that to try to squeeze some more things out of it, you know. I remember when we were doing that stuff with sample sound, it was the sample sounds were being triggered on the non-maskable interrupt, you know, and what you would do is you would get the foreground and the raster interrupt doing your main routine and getting the non-maskable interrupt doing the sample sound, and what happened was you would just keep tweaking the register on the speed of the non-maskable interrupt until the whole thing just died, because at that point there was no more CPU left to do anything. So, okay, that's how you found out what rate you could actually try to get a sample out of that thing. The most I ever did on the C64 was 2 sample channels, and which was like 2-bit audio or something like that mixed together. That was the most I ever did on it, but at that point it was getting really painful to do squeeze anything more out of it. One of the other things that I did in the 80s, I did other things besides the C64. I used to do 8-bit Atari. If anybody remembers the 8-bit Atari, that was quite a screaming box CPU-wise. And there was also Atari ST, Amiga. There was a thing called the Einstein Tatum, which was, there was also the MSX machines. And there was this awful thing called the Sinclair Spectrum, if anybody remembers that. And then there was this other thing called an Amstrad. Amstrad was a 64K, and then there was an Amstrad 128, which was another absolute dog of a machine. But at that time, I used to do ports as well. But what I did was I developed a system so that well, she was my girlfriend at the time. She became my wife. You know, she would be able to understand enough about the data format that I used on a C64 to be able to get all this stuff across to these other machines. So, you know, I used to get her to do all that stuff for us, because I was still also playing gigs with the band as well at that time. And I used to have this room set up with these, it was like a kind of a U-shaped type of thing like that. And I had 11 machines surrounded by us at that point, you know. So I had like 2 C64s, a couple of Ataris, an ST. I was one of the first people to buy an Amiga. I paid £1,000 for my Amiga just because of all the hype and the press and everything about the Amiga. And it was a little bit painful to program the Amiga in those days as well. we used to we never had a debugger in the early days, so we used to write down this 68,000 code. If there was a bug, you just had to write it down on a piece of paper and then just keep looking at it until you figured out what the hell the bug was. That was your debugger, you know. I remember a friend of mine who was just an incredible guy, used to work for EA, then he worked for 3DO. This guy is just an awesome programmer. I said to him, you know, what's the best debugger? And he said, I have this doll that I have. It's like a little doll, it's a dummy. He says, I put it on a chair, and I says, well, how does that help you debug code, you know? He says, well, I explain to this little doll, this dummy, you know, what the problem is, or what's happening with the code and why it doesn't work. And by the time I do it, and I've explained to this dummy who doesn't know much, by the time I actually explain it, I generally figure out what the problem is. So, you know, that's it's an interesting way of trying to debug code. I tried it, and it, you know, it didn't always work for me. You know, most of the time, if you can't figure out a bug, it tends to be something really, really, really simple, like you've missed off a little hash mark, or you know, you've just forgot to initialize something, or something of that nature. Anyway, I moved to the US in 1977. I did a 2-month contract and worked on Skate or Die, and they thought that was okay, so they offered me a job. So I said, do you want to work in the UK or do you want to work in the US? So I said, let me think about that for half a second. I said, I want to work in the US. So I moved to the US, and at that time, you know, going back to the cultural aspects of this, it really became apparent the huge differences between what happens on the other side of the Atlantic and what happens in Europe regarding music and the culture. And you know, the one regret that I have about moving there was that I missed out on an awful lot of developments in Europe, because I was in the US at the time. I missed out on a lot of this stuff that happened with the development of the culture and the whole demo scene and what happened with music, because you know, music is much more it's much more important in Europe. People are much more into music in Europe. People are much more aware of music in Europe, and they have, in general, you know, better taste than what the Americans do, I would say. And so it was a bit of a shock for me, you know, going to in the United States, where the culture is so different and people are into such different kinds of games and kind of different ways of doing things. You have to become very aware of what goes on over there. If you ever work for any of the American companies or publishers, the music reflects, you know, what goes on the radio stations and what goes on the TV and things like that. And in Europe, people are much more into music than what the Americans are. Also, there's a radical difference in games in the United States and in Europe. You know, they tend to be much more kind of simulation, realism kind of orientated, as opposed to Europe, which is kind of more kind of innovative and, you know, I would say more kind of fun orientated than what the Americans are. Well, that's a bit of a generalization, but you know, I would say that that was something that you have to become aware of really quickly. So when I was over in America, one of the things that we had to start working on besides Amigas was the IBM PC, which had like this just no sound whatsoever. And one of the strange things that happened while I was over there was the IBM called me up to ask my advice about sound chips, because they were coming up with a new PC. I can't even remember what it was called. It was like a PS or something, or of course, as soon as I say that, I always think of PlayStation, but it was an IBM PS something or other. And they called me up and asked me about sound chips, and I said, well, if you want the state of the art, which the state of the art at the time was like the FM sound chip stuff by Yamaha, and I said, well, that's probably going to, cost you this much. I said, there's this really crappy Texas Instruments chip called the TI, the chip, which was the same chip that was in, the Amstrad and the MSX and stuff. This really awful chip. And I said, that's really, really cheap. And there was a couple of other things that I mentioned as well. And then eventually they shipped the box and they used like the crappy Texas Instruments chip. So, the audio that the hardware of the game machines and computers was running, to my estimate, about 5 to 10 years behind of what was happening in the music industry. Microsoft were working on this thing called the multimedia PC, called an MPC standard, if anybody remembers that. That was happening at that time, and the early sound cards started to be developed for the PC. There was a thing called the FB01 and then an Adlib card, which was a 2-op FM chip. And then there was a thing called an MT32 started to be around on the PC, which was a precursor to the sound canvas. One of the innovative companies at that time was Sierra Games. They used to do these huge adventure games, and they really became very good at exploiting the audio on the PC. One of my friends left to join Microsoft, and he offered me a job at Microsoft back in 1990, and at the time I looked at what they thought of the IBM PC, and I thought, hang on, you have like a piezo speaker, you have one interrupt. Amiga has like, how many interrupts does an Amiga have? It has at least 4, right? Plus it has 4 channel sample sound. I thought,
It has a 60K processor, it has at least 8 interrupt levels.
Yeah, exactly. So, I was looking at what kind of standard Microsoft were in those days, and I thought, man, I wouldn't want to work for these people if they're the last people on earth. They don't know what they're doing. How wrong I was. If I wish I'd gone to Microsoft back in 1990, because then I'd be, almost as rich as Bill Gates, But the other thing that then happened was the console started to appear. There was an 8-bit Nintendo machine came out. There was a thing called an Apple II GS, if anybody remembers that, which was a 65/816 machine. And then there was the development of the 16-bit consoles, which was the Sega Genesis, which had a FM chip plus a very primitive sampling capability. The Sega Genesis had a 68,000 main processor and a Z80 processor, and it had a mutually exclusive communication bus between the two processors. And so I used to tell everybody this whenever I was involved with Sega Genesis stuff, and I kept telling people, look, this you have to be aware of this. You can't use the Z80, otherwise, we can't get any audio. So I remember this guy did a helicopter simulation on the Sega Genesis, and I said, so, okay, how are you doing this? And he said, I'm using the 68,000, and I'm using the Z80 to do some decompression of some graphics stuff, And I said, well, that's really wonderful, because that means you're going to get no audio out of this thing, So people have to really listen to the audio people when they talk about some of these issues. After the Sega Genesis, there was a thing called the Super Nintendo, which was also had a kind of a primitive sampling capability, and then the 32-bit machines came out. The PS1, there was a thing called the Atari Jaguar, there was a thing called the handheld Lynx, which was developed by the same guys, Dave Needle and R.J. Michael. I have a really funny story about Dave Needle, but I couldn't tell it here. If anybody wants to ask me, they can come and see me afterwards. Because those guys were also involved with the development of the 3DO machine, which was Trip Hawkins left Electronic Arts to form 3DO, and his vision was this whole kind of, originally he wanted to call the box Medio, because his vision was, there was audio, there was video, and then he wanted this thing for media, interactive media, and so he wanted to call the box Medio. He had this thing about audio, video, and then something for, to replace it. And he wanted the 3DO box to become this open standard like a video machine. And Dave Needle and R.J. Michael were involved in the development of the 3DO box, and they were also consulting me at that time about what kind of hardware to put in the 3DO box, and we were going to use FM chip because that was the state of the art at the time. But as fate would have it, they kind of ran over budget with the design of the hardware, and so they ended up with virtually nothing for the audio on the 3DO box. And then they got the business model wrong on 3DO, and so that's why it died. The other thing that then happened was the N64 came out, and then we had the 64-bit machines, the PS2 and the Xbox, GameCube, and that's when that's where we are with the business today. So, we have about 10 minutes left, and okay, we have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes.
Okay. So if anybody, wants to ask any questions or is curious about any stuff, I have an example of a printout of a couple of things here, of a little bit of source code and some music data from the C64. I have some example of some Z80 code. Is anybody a Z80 process? Z80? I shouldn't say Z80. Z80 programmers here. Z80 was just an absolute dog to program. So if you didn't program it, you didn't miss anything. But I have some other stuff here, which is a lot of real nostalgic stuff from the early days of this portfolio that I kept that I never ever threw away, which is, you know, I've got loads of stuff from all the old early games like Monty, and you know, I have like some reviews from from some of the magazines and some of the interviews that I did, and this is that's a picture of me with Jules Holland where we were at an award ceremony, and I have a little story about that I can't repeat here as well. So, you know, if anybody wants to ask any questions about any of this stuff, then, you know, feel free. Okay, no questions.
I guess we don't have enough time for that, but maybe afterwards.
Yeah,
after
okay.
the second
Yeah.
seminar you're holding.
Yeah, okay.
We can take a look at outside of that.
Okay. So I guess that's it. They want to get everybody out from, you know, get things set up for the next you know, I think that how many people in this room are musicians? Okay, you're the lucky ones, because, you know, music is just this, it's like a journey through life where, you know, you really start off learning about music and doing things, and you go to bed with dreams of music, doing things, and you really have no idea where it's going to lead to or what you're going to do with it. And, you know, it stays in your blood, you know, becomes part of your genetic makeup or something. It stays in your blood and it never ever goes, you know. I started when I was like 5 years old. I wrote a tune on the piano, and then like my parents thought, what the hell's he doing? I didn't know anything, you know. I was just 5 years old. I didn't know anything about music, but I wrote a little tune. They thought, well, better, you know, get him a piano. But I went to university as well to do electronics, and I hated it. I spent all my time in the music department playing the piano. What the hell am I doing here? But, you know, and so I left there and I just went into a band straight away and started playing music. So the answer to your question, what I'm saying is that, yes, this thing stays in your blood all your life, you know, and you know, I've started playing music again. I went through I wrote an awful lot of music between, you know, 1980. I wrote before I did C64 stuff. I wrote a lot of music before then as well. So I'd always been composing a lot of music. But between 1980 and, you know, round about, you know, 1995, I just wrote an absolute bloody ton. And I got completely fried. I got completely burnt out writing music. And since then, I haven't actively, you know, sat down and created projects for myself. But that doesn't mean to say that I won't do it again, because, like I say, I think this thing stays in your blood, you know, becomes part of you, you know. You get into different kind of things, and you go in different directions, you morph off into this direction, you know. So I think that at some stage I will probably start writing again, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.